The house threw away its own son because his gift turned out useless. No army, no supplies, no allowance. Just an empty field the size of a whole district and a body that can barely stand. And in a week, the soldiers will come back and refuse to believe their own eyes. So Junho opens his eyes under a strange gray sky that rocks above him. His back aches. His body feels wrong. Too thin. Too light. Fingers too long and soft, like they never held anything heavier than a brush. He lies on a wooden cart that reeks of wet straw and horse dung. 4 soldiers in dented armor ride alongside. One of them spots his open eyes and spits to the side. He says the exile is awake, and they should dump him before the horses catch his bad luck. Junho tries to sit up. His arms buckle. This body has no strength at all. He props himself on one elbow and stares down at his hands. Pale, young, early 20s maybe. A scroll with a heavy wax seal lies at his feet, between muddy boots that are not his. The lead soldier stops the cart and tells him to get off. He says the land ahead belongs to him now, by order of Lord So Hyunggu, and that the House of So has no further use for a son whose awakening gift is rated domestic and insignificant. He throws the scroll. It hits Junho in the chest like a brick. Junho falls off the cart sideways into cold mud. The soldiers laugh. One says they should come back in a week to collect the body. The cart turns and leaves him there. Junho lies face down in the mud for a long time. Cold soaks through the thin robe into his skin. This body breathes differently. Shorter lungs, weaker chest. He rolls onto his back and stares at the sky. His last memory from before flashes through. A desk. A model of a residential quarter built from foam board and balsa wood. The north wing with the playground placed wrong because the winter sun would never reach it. 3 in the morning. A groan of metal above him. Then nothing. And now this. Junho sits up in the mud and looks around. A flat field stretches in every direction under a pale sky. No trees except one dead oak 200 meters northeast. No buildings, no roads, just grass and dirt and a crooked boundary post with a rotting ribbon. Wind cuts from the northwest, steady and cold. He sniffs the air. Water somewhere close. A stream, maybe 200 meters south. He presses his fingers into the soft, clay-heavy ground and tests its density the way he did 1,000 times on construction sites in a world he no longer belongs to. And then something clicks. Not in his mind, in his chest. A warmth. A recognition. Like a tool finding the hand it was made for. Junho looks at the field again, and his brain takes over on its own. The slope runs gentle, 5 degrees southeast. Perfect for drainage. The northwest wind means chimneys must offset to dodge downdraft. The dead oak marks a rise in elevation, which means drier soil and better footing for a foundation. The stream sits downhill, which means gravity-fed water. He plots setbacks. He calculates lot lines. He imagines where the sun hits at 8 in winter and where shadows pool at 4 in summer. He spent 27 years in another life designing buildings other people stamped their names on. 6 housing projects for low-income families. Every single one stolen by his senior partner, who smiled and clapped his shoulder and said the firm appreciated his contribution. He died with his face on a foam model that would never get built. And now he sits in mud on a field the size of a district with no owner and no plan and no senior partner and nothing at all except dirt and wind and water and a body that can barely stand. Junho starts laughing. Not loud, not crazy. A quiet, stunned laugh, like a man who opens a door expecting a closet and finds the ocean. He pushes himself to his feet. His knees shake. He wipes the mud off his hands and whispers to no one that this is not exile. This is a sight. The biggest sight he has ever been given. And this time, nobody is going to take it from him. He walks the perimeter for an hour. The body is weak, but the legs work if he moves slow. The scroll turns out to be a deed of grant, stamped with the seal of House So. It hands So Junho all lands inside the boundary markers of Sector 47 of the Outer Marches, several hundred acres at least. The deed notes his gift is registered as auto-build and rated non-combat and non-strategic. A final line releases him from all obligations to the house and grants him no stipend, no garrison, no supplies. They threw him away. He folds the scroll and keeps walking. The stream sits exactly where he expected, clear water over smooth stones. He kneels and drinks. The stream bed runs with gravel, which means harder rock lies close below. Good. Quarrying is possible. He follows the water and finds a bank of fine sand where it curves around a low hill. Sand means mortar. Mortar means masonry. He is already designing in his head. A settlement needs 5 things first: water, shelter, heat, food storage, a perimeter. Water he has. Shelter he figures out tonight. He gathers dead wood from the oak. He clears a patch near the stream and rings it with stones. His fingers work slow and clumsy in the cold, but the motions run automatic. He strikes sparks from a flint and a steel buckle. 40 minutes later, the fire catches. By dusk he has a small, steady flame and a rough lean-to of branches against the oak. It is terrible. No insulation, no windbreak, the roof angle too shallow to shed rain. He looks at it with the professional disgust of a man who once designed passive energy housing for 300 families. But it keeps him alive one night. He sits by the fire and eats nothing, because he has nothing. His stomach complains. He needs food by tomorrow. He is thinking about caloric deficits and protein when a sound breaks from the tree line to the north. A cough. Wet and deep and rattling. Then a smaller sound, a child whimpering. Junho stands and squints into the dark. 2 figures stumble out of the shadows. An old woman bent almost double over a stick. A small girl, maybe 6 years old, clinging to her skirt. The old woman coughs again, and the sound is bad, fluid in the lungs. They head toward his fire. The old woman sees him and stops. She shoves the child behind her and raises the stick in a shaking hand. Junho holds still. He tells them to come to the fire and that he will not hurt them. The old woman stares a long moment. Then her legs give out and she drops hard to the ground. The girl bursts into tears. Junho walks to them slow. The old woman burns with fever, gray skin, wet, clicking breath. The girl runs hot enough to feel from a handspan away, both barefoot. Their clothes scorched at the edges, smoke damage. They came from a fire. He asks where they are from. The old woman says her name is Grandmother Han, and the girl is her granddaughter, Minso. Their village stood 3 days east. Demons from the outer forest came at night. Everything burned. Everyone ran. She grabbed the child and walked west away from the flames. 3 days ago. They have not eaten since the first day. Junho helps them to the fire. He gives Grandmother Han his lean-to and wraps the girl in his outer robe. She is too weak to protest. Grandmother Han coughs against the oak, and between coughs, she tells him he is a good boy and asks if he is a soldier. He says no. She asks if he is a lord. He says technically yes, but not the useful kind. She asks what kind of lord is not useful. He says the kind who builds things. She looks at him with eyes that have seen too many fires and too many dead people, and says a lord who builds things sounds useful to her. Junho sits on the cold ground and looks at the woman and the child. The girl is 6 and feverish and sleeping in an open field in autumn because every building she ever knew burned down. The old woman drowns in her own lungs and will die if she spends another night in the cold. Something stirs in his chest. Not magic exactly, a frequency, a tuning fork struck and waiting to resonate. He grabs a stick and starts drawing in the dirt by the fire. The entrance faces south to catch maximum winter sun. The hearth goes against the north wall, so the thermal mass soaks heat all day and radiates it back at night. A sleeping platform above the firebox, because heat rises, and the warmest spot sits directly above the heat source. That is where the girl sleeps. A second small window low on the east wall, so the child sees the yard from her bed without sitting up. When you are sick and small, the world shrinks to what you can see, and a blank wall makes the fear worse. The chimney needs 2 bins, not 1. 2 bins pull a longer path for the hot gases, which means more heat into the masonry and less chance of carbon monoxide backdraft on wind shifts. The door frame recesses slightly to buffer the wind. The walls double layer, with an air gap for insulation. He draws fast now. The stick runs through the dirt like a pin on paper. The frequency in his chest swells. Not a sound, a vibration, like the ground itself listens. He draws the floor plan with dimensions from memory. 2 rooms, 1 main room with the hearth, and a smaller room behind for storage and bathing. A covered porch on the south side for sitting in the sun. Roof pitch at 35 degrees for snow load. He feels the ground warming under his hand. Not from the fire, from something else. The clay shifts. The soil compacts. He keeps drawing. Strip footing 30 centimeters deep. Load-bearing walls 40 centimeters thick. A simple king post truss. He draws everything he would have drawn in an office with a computer and coffee and proper light. Except here his desk is frozen ground, and his pen is a stick, and his client is a dying old woman and a sick child. And the ground hears him. He feels it, not as power, as recognition. Like a hand reaches up through the clay and takes the blueprint from his fingers and says, "Yes, I understand. I will build this." His vision blurs. Exhaustion slams into him like a wall. Every muscle goes slack at once. He drops the stick and falls sideways onto the cold ground. The last thing he sees before his eyes close is the dirt in front of him starting to move. Slow, deliberate, like something enormous waking up. The 4 soldiers ride back on the 7th morning to confirm the death of the exiled son of House So. They expect a corpse, or at best a half-starved wretch under a pile of branches. The lead soldier crests the low hill by the stream and stops his horse. The other 3 pull up behind him. Nobody speaks for a long time. Where there had been nothing but flat grass and a dead oak, there now stands a house. A real house. Stone walls, a proper roof with wooden shingles, a chimney breathing thin white smoke straight into the morning air, a covered porch with a bench, a door with a frame. And carved into the door frame in letters no chisel cut sit 2 names. Han. Minso. The lead soldier dismounts slow. He walks to the wall and touches the stone. It is warm. Not hot. Warm. Like a living thing. He looks through the window and sees a clean room with a hearth burning low and steady. The old woman sleeps on a bench wrapped in a blanket that seems woven from the same wool as the sheep grazing behind the house. Sheep that stood nowhere a week ago. The girl sits up in a raised bed above the hearth. Her cheeks run pink. Her fever is gone. She looks at the soldier through the window and waves. He steps back. He looks around and sees the house is not alone. A second, smaller structure stands nearby. A storage shed with a sloped roof and a ventilated base. A root cellar door behind it. A stone-lined path runs from the house to the stream where a clean water channel feeds a stone basin. A fence of sharpened stakes circles the whole property. Not grand, not military. Solid and intentional, and designed by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Junho walks out of the house. He looks terrible. Dark circles, thinner than a week ago. His hands shake. But he stands alive and looks at the soldiers with an expression the lead soldier has never seen on any lord he ever served. Satisfaction. The quiet, deep satisfaction of a man who has built something real. The soldier asks him what happened here. Junho says he built a house. The soldier says that is impossible. Nobody builds a stone house in a week alone on empty land with no tools and no workers. Junho shrugs. He says the land helped. The soldier stares at him, then at the house, then at the shed, then at the water channel, then at the fence. He climbs back on his horse and tells the others they are leaving. A younger soldier asks what they will report. The lead soldier goes quiet a moment. Then he says they will report that the exile is alive and the land is settled, and something is happening out here that he does not understand. They ride away. Junho watches them go. Then he goes back inside and sits by the fire. Minso looks at him from her bed and asks if he is a good wizard. He tells her he is an architect, and it is almost the same thing, but more boring. She asks what an architect is. He says a person who makes houses for people who need them. She thinks about it. Then she asks if he can make a house for the rabbits too, because they live outside and it is cold. Junho looks at the 6-year-old girl who a week ago was dying of fever in an open field, and now worries about the rabbits. He says he will think about it. Grandmother Han wakes and coughs, but the cough runs drier now. Better. She looks at Junho and bows her head all the way to the floor and stays there. He tells her to stop. She says she will stop when she is dead. He sighs and goes outside to check the fence. There is work to do. There is always going to be work to do. 3 days after the soldiers left, the first stranger appeared. A man in his 40s, with a broken arm splinted with sticks and rags. He came from the east, walking along the stream. He saw the smoke from the chimney and followed it. His name was Doksam, and he had been a farmhand in a village called Yomni until demons burned it 2 weeks ago. He had survived by hiding in a ditch with his face pressed into the mud while everything above him turned to fire. His arm had been broken by a falling beam. He had walked west because he heard there was unclaimed land in the outer marches, and unclaimed land meant nobody would chase you off it. Junho looked at his arm and said the splint was wrong. The bones were not aligned, and if they healed that way, he would never use the arm again. Doksam said he knew. He said he had accepted it. Junho told him to sit down. He went inside and came back with 2 straight sticks and a strip of cloth he had torn from his own robe. He reset the bone while Doksam bit down on a leather strap and made no sound except a single, low groan. Then Junho wrapped it properly, with the sticks aligned along the bone and the cloth wound in a figure-8 pattern to prevent rotation. It was not surgery. It was first aid from a construction site safety course he had taken 8 years ago in another life. But it was correct. Doksam looked at his arm and then at Junho and asked who he was. Junho said he was the lord of this land. Doksam laughed. He said that was the first time he had seen a lord splint a farmhand's arm. Junho said he was a different kind of lord. Doksam asked what kind. Junho said the kind who needed people. Doksam looked at the house and the shed and the fence and the water channel and asked if Junho had built all of this. Junho said yes. Doksam asked how. Junho said it was complicated. Then he asked Doksam what he was good at. Doksam said he could plow a field and tend livestock and cut timber. Junho said, perfect. He said he needed all 3 of those things. He told Doksam he could stay if he wanted, and that there would be a roof over his head by tomorrow. Doksam stared at him for a long time. Then he nodded. That night, Junho sat on the ground outside by the fire and drew in the dirt again. This time he was not drawing a house for Grandmother Han and Minso. He was drawing a house for a man named Doksam, who had a broken right arm and was right-handed and needed a space where everything important was reachable with his left hand until the arm healed. The door handle on the left side. The storage shelf at waist height on the left wall. The bed positioned so he could roll out to the left. The wood pile inside the door on the left. The frequency in his chest hummed again, softer this time. The ground shifted. By morning, there was a second house next to the first, smaller, simpler, a single room with a hearth and a bed and a storage shelf. But the door handle was on the left, and the shelf was at waist height on the left wall. And Doksam stood in the doorway with his good arm hanging at his side and his broken arm cradled against his chest, and he did not say anything for a very long time. Then he turned to Junho and said this was the first time anyone had built something for him. Junho said he should not get used to it, because the next house Doksam would build himself. Doksam smiled for the first time since Junho had met him. Over the next 4 days, 5 more people arrived. A mother and daughter from a village to the south that had been raided by tax soldiers from Neymester Beck. An old carpenter named Gunchill, who had been expelled from his guild for refusing to pay a bribe. A teenage boy named Yeonwoo who had run away from a mining camp where children worked until they dropped. And a woman named Wolhee who said nothing about where she came from or what had happened to her, but who flinched whenever anyone raised a hand near her face. Junho spoke to each of them, not long speeches, short conversations. He asked the mother what her daughter liked to do. She said the girl liked to draw pictures in the dirt with sticks. He asked Gunchill what kind of wood he preferred working with. Gunchill said he liked elm because it was stubborn and rewarded patience. He asked Yeonwoo what he wanted to be when he grew up. By the end of the first week, there were 7 buildings, including the original house. A small settlement. It was not much, simple structures, arranged in a rough curve along the stream. But it was not random. Junho had placed each building with intent. The hearth smoke from every house drifted northeast away from the others because of the prevailing wind. The paths between buildings were on higher ground, so they would not flood in rain. The storage shed was equidistant from all houses, so no one had to walk further than anyone else. The latrine was downhill and downstream from the water channel. Gunchill noticed it first. He walked the settlement one morning looking at the layout and stopped in the center and turned slowly in a circle. Then he came to Junho and said something strange. He said this was not a camp. He said he had built camps before and worked on villages and even helped construct a section of a lord's manor once. He said camps are scattered, villages grow crooked, manors follow the lord's whim. But this had a shape, a logic. Like someone had imagined the whole thing at once before putting down the first stone. Junho said that was because someone had. Gunchill asked who. Junho said himself. Gunchill stared at him. Then he asked if Junho would teach him. Junho felt something loosen in his chest. A knot he had not known was there. In his old life, nobody had ever asked to learn from him. They had asked to copy his work. They had asked to use his designs. But nobody had sat down across from him and said, "Teach me how you think." He told Gunchill yes. He said they would start with foundations. The water channel was Junho's first infrastructure project. The stream had good flow, but carrying water in buckets was inefficient and exhausting. He needed a channel from the stream to a central basin where everyone could draw water. The question was slope. Too steep, and the water would erode the channel walls. Too shallow, and the flow would stagnate and breed disease. He needed a gradient of about 1 centimeter per meter over a distance of roughly 200 meters. He had no level, no transit, no surveying equipment of any kind. What he had was a bowl of water and a straight stick. He set the bowl on the ground and marked where the water surface touched the rim on all sides. Level. Then, he used the stick as a sight line and walked the route from the stream to the settlement, marking the gradient with small stones every 10 meters. It took him most of a day. Gunchill watched and asked questions. Junho explained. He said water always finds the lowest point. He said the job of a channel builder was not to force water somewhere, but to show it where it already wanted to go. Gunchill nodded slowly and said that sounded like a proverb. Junho said it was hydraulic engineering. They dug the channel together over 3 days. Junho drew the cross-section in the dirt. A trapezoidal shape was best for stability, wider at the top than the bottom, sides angled at about 60 degrees. A thin layer of clay packed on the inside to prevent seepage. Gunchill dug with his good arm and his feet, and sometimes his head. Doksam helped with his one working arm. Yeonwoo carried stones. The mother and daughter packed clay. Wolhee brought water from the stream to mix the clay. Grandmother Han supervised everyone while sitting on a rock and coughing. On the evening of the 3rd day, water flowed through the completed channel into a stone basin at the center of the settlement. Everyone stood around the basin and watched the water fill it. Nobody spoke. Water. Clean, running water in the middle of their camp. The mother sat down on the ground and put her face in her hands, and her shoulders shook. Junho looked at her and then looked away. He knew what was happening. She was not crying because of the water. She was crying because the water meant someone had thought about her. Someone had planned for her to be here. Someone had said, there will be a basin of clean water, and it will be close to where you live, so you do not have to walk far. That kind of thinking. That kind of consideration. Some people had never experienced it in their entire lives. Junho cleared his throat and said the basin needed a drain plug and that he would add one tomorrow, and that nobody should let the children play in it because it was drinking water, not a bath. The moment broke gently, and people went back to their houses, and the settlement was quiet except for the sound of water flowing into stone. 3 days later, the soldiers returned. Not the same 4 from before. These were different. 10 of them. Better armed. They wore the insignia of Namester Beck. The lead soldier was a heavy-set man with a scar across his nose, who introduced himself as Tax Lieutenant Muhan. He said that all settlements in the outer marches owed quarterly tribute to the office of Namester Beck Guanzhou. He said the tribute for this quarter was 10 bags of grain and 1 bag of salt, and that failure to pay would result in the settlement being classified as an illegal encampment and demolished. Junho stood in front of his settlement and looked at the 10 armed men. Junho spent the next 3 days doing something that looked insane to everyone watching. He walked. He walked the entire perimeter of his land from boundary post to boundary post. He walked the stream from its source at a rocky spring in the hills to where it curved south and disappeared into a gully. He walked the tree line of the forest to the north, and the open grassland to the south, and the low ridge to the east, and the marshy depression to the west. He carried a stick, and he scratched marks into rocks, and he tied strips of cloth to bushes, and he muttered to himself constantly. Gunchil followed him for the first day and asked what he was doing. Junho said he was surveying. Gunchil asked what that meant. Junho said he was learning the shape of the land. Where water collects after rain, where the wind is strongest, where the soil is deepest, where the rock is close to the surface, where the sun hits first in the morning, and where it lingers last in the evening. Gunchil said it sounded like he was trying to understand the land the way you would understand a person. Junho stopped walking and looked at him. Then he said yes. That was exactly what he was doing. Because the gift worked the same way with land as it did with people. He had to know it, not in the abstract, not as a map, as a thing with a name and a character and preferences. This particular land drained southeast. Its soil was clay-heavy in the flats and sandy near the stream and rocky on the ridge. Its wind came from the northwest in autumn and from the north in winter. Its frost line was about 40 centimeters down, based on the depth of unfrozen ground he had measured by pushing his stick into the earth at 30 different points. Its best building site was the gentle rise between the stream and the oak tree, where the ground was firm and dry, and the morning sun arrived early. That was where the settlement already stood. His instinct had been right on the first day. But the settlement could not grow there. It could hold maybe 20 buildings at most before the rise ran out of room, and expansion would push into the flood zone near the stream or the wind-exposed flat to the north. So he needed a plan. Not a plan for 20 buildings. A plan for 100. For 500. For 1,000. He needed to think about this land not as a campsite, but as a city. That was insane. He knew it was insane. He had 8 people and 7 buildings and no food reserves and a tax collector coming back in a month. But the part of his brain that had spent 6 years designing residential districts in Seoul could not help it. It saw the land and it saw potential, and it started working. He returned to the settlement on the 4th day and sat down on the ground in the center and began to draw. Not a house this time. A grid. A street plan. He drew the main road running northeast to southwest along the ridge. He drew cross streets at regular intervals, perpendicular to the main road. He drew blocks between the streets, sized for 4 to 6 houses each. The first test came 3 days later. A group of 14 people arrived from the northeast. Farmers from 2 villages that had been hit by the plague sweeping down from the northern provinces. They had fled south to escape the sickness, and they had followed the stream west, because water leads to people. They were exhausted and frightened, and several of the children were coughing in a way that made Junho nervous. He met them at the edge of the settlement and stopped them there. He told them they could not enter yet. The farmers were angry. One of them, a big man with a red face, said they had walked for 6 days and their children were sick. And who was this skinny boy to turn them away? Junho said he was not turning them away. He said he needed to know who was sick and who was healthy, because if the plague came into the settlement, it would kill everyone, including the people they were trying to save. The big farmer stared at him. Junho said he would set up a separate camp downstream for those who were ill. Clean water, fire, shelter. He would build it tonight. Those who were healthy could enter the settlement in the morning after a day of observation. The farmer said this was madness. Junho said no. This was quarantine. The farmer did not know the word. Junho explained, separate the sick from the healthy. Treat the sick. Protect the healthy. Let time prove who is which. It was not cruelty. It was the only way to save everyone. The farmer looked at his children. 2 of them were coughing. He looked at the settlement behind Junho. 7 solid buildings. Smoke from chimneys. A stone water basin. A fence. It was more than anything he had seen in weeks of walking. He asked if Junho would really build shelter for them tonight. Junho said yes. He asked if the sick children would be warm. Junho said yes. The farmer nodded. Junho spent that night drawing a quarantine station. It was not just a shed, it was a proper field hospital laid out the way he remembered from a disaster relief seminar he had attended in another life. 2 separate wards, one for patients with symptoms, one for observation cases who had been exposed but showed no signs. A corridor between them sealed on both sides so caregivers could move between wards without crossing through the healthy population. A ventilation system using the chimney effect. Hot air rises, so if you place the inlet low and the outlet high, the ward continuously cycles fresh air through it. He drew latrines downstream from the wards, with a separate water source to prevent contamination of the main channel. He drew a hand-washing station at the entrance. Clay basins filled from the stream with a simple gravity-fed flow. He thought about each of the sick children specifically, their names which he had asked for, how old they were, how long they had been coughing, which ones had fever and which did not. The ground hummed. By morning, there was a building downstream from the settlement. 2 rooms, a corridor, chimneys drawing air upward and out, clay basins by the door, beds for 7 patients, each with a name carved into the headboard. Junho collapsed on the ground outside the quarantine station and slept for 14 hours. When he woke up, Grandmother Han was sitting next to him with a bowl of fish broth. She said 3 of the children were already breathing better and that the big farmer had not stopped pacing back and forth in front of the healthy ward, asking every 10 minutes if his daughter was improving. Junho drank the broth and asked if anyone else had arrived. Grandmother Han said 2 more families had come from the south while he slept. He sighed and got up. Within 2 weeks, the settlement had 31 people and 12 buildings. Junho could feel the change. It was not just numbers, it was density. When 8 people lived in 7 buildings, there was space between everything. Space to breathe. Space to think. Now, with 31 people, the spaces were filling up. Paths were being worn into the grass. The water basin was not large enough. The common wood pile was shrinking faster than anyone could replenish it. Gunchil came to him on the 15th morning and said there was a problem. He said some of the newer arrivals were cutting timber from the forest without replanting. Others were dumping waste behind their houses instead of using the latrine. 2 families were arguing over who had the right to fish in a particular bend of the stream. Junho listened and nodded. He had been expecting this. 8 people is a family. 30 is a village, and a village needs rules. He gathered everyone at the central basin that evening. It was cold. Autumn was deepening toward winter. Breath made clouds. Children clung to their parents. Junho stood on a flat stone next to the basin and spoke. He did not give a speech about unity or shared purpose or the importance of community. He talked about sewage. He said that waste dumped on the ground seeps into groundwater within 40 days, and that anyone drinking from the stream downstream would be drinking diluted filth within a month. He said the timber from the northern forest needed to last through winter, and that if they cut it all now, they would have no building material in spring. He said the stream had enough fish for everyone if they rotated fishing spots and let each section rest for 3 days between catches. He talked for 20 minutes about practical things: sanitation schedules, timber quotas, fishing rotations, water usage, fire safety, where to store food, how to maintain the channel. When he was done, the big farmer, whose name was Taxation, stood up and said this was a lot of rules. Junho said yes. Taxation asked what happened if someone broke them. Junho said nothing happened. He said there were no punishments. But if someone dumped waste in the wrong place and people got sick, then the person who got sick would know who caused it. And if someone overfished a section and the fish disappeared, then the person who had nothing to eat would know why. He said the rules were not his rules. They were the consequence of living close together. He was just saying out loud what the land already knew. Taxation thought about this for a moment. Then he sat down. Nobody argued. The rules went into effect that night. Junho carved them into a flat piece of wood and hung it on the central basin. It was the first law of the settlement, and it was about sewage. 10 days later, Junho woke to the sound of hooves. He rolled out of bed and went outside, and the morning air hit him like a slap. Frost covered the ground. The first hard frost of autumn. Winter was close. Maybe 3 weeks away. The horseman was alone. Not a soldier. A messenger in a gray riding cloak with the seal of the regional magistrate's office. He dismounted and handed Junho a sealed letter. Junho opened it. The letter was from the office of Mester Beck Guanjo. It informed the landholder of Sector 47 that a formal survey and tax assessment would be conducted in 21 days, that a magistrate would accompany the assessors. A mill needed 3 things: moving water, stone for the grinding wheels, and grain to justify building it. Junho had the first 2. The stream had a section about 400 meters upstream from the settlement where it dropped over a rocky ledge, creating a natural fall of about 2 meters. That was enough head for an overshot wheel. The rocky ridge to the east had exposed limestone that could be shaped into millstones with enough labor. But the grain was the problem. The next morning, every able person in the settlement was out in the grassland. 31 people, minus the children and the sick, spread across the fields in a long line moving slowly east. They cut wild barley with knives and sickles, and in some cases just pulled it up by hand. It was miserable work. The barley was sparse, and the stalks were thin, and the cold made fingers numb within an hour. But they worked. Taxation, the big farmer, organized the crew into sections and assigned each section a plot to clear. Junho built carrying frames from scrap wood so the harvesters could carry bundles on their backs. Yanwu ran between the groups carrying water. Grandmother Han sat at the collection point and sorted the grain from the chaff using a flat basket in the wind. By the end of the first day, they had collected enough barley to fill 2 large sacks. Junho did the math in his head. At this rate, they would need 15 days to collect 30 bags. That left 6 days before the assessors arrived. Tight, but possible. But collecting grain was only half the problem. They also needed to grind it, because raw barley was worth less than flour, and the tax assessors would want to see a functioning economy, not a pile of weeds. So Junho built the mill while everyone else harvested. He spent the first night drawing it. An overshot water wheel with a diameter of 3 meters. Wooden construction with a stone axle bearing. The wheel turns a vertical shaft connected to a horizontal stone runner through a set of wooden gears. The runner stone sits on top of a fixed bedstone. Grain feeds in through a hopper above the eye of the runner. Flour comes out around the edge and falls into a collection trough. He had studied mill design in a historical architecture course and had always been fascinated by the engineering elegance of medieval water mills. The efficiency of an overshot wheel could reach 70%, far better than an undershot design. The key was the buckets on the wheel rim. Water fills them at the top, and gravity pulls them down. The weight of the falling water turns the wheel. He drew every component: the wheel frame, the axle, the gear assembly, the millstone housing, the hopper, the chute, the sluice gate to control water flow, the tail race to return water to the stream. He drew it all, and he thought about who would use it. Grandmother Han needing bread for the children. Wolhe, who never spoke, but who had started grinding wild seeds with a handstone and leaving flatbread on people's doorsteps at dawn. The big farmer Taxation, who had told Junho last night that his daughter loved fresh bread and had not had any in 2 months. The frequency hummed, the ground moved. This time it was different. A mill was not a house. It was heavier, more complex, more mechanical. Junho could feel the draw on his body like a physical weight pressing down on his chest. His vision narrowed. His hands went cold. He kept drawing. The axle needs to be oak because oak resists water damage. The gear teeth need to be cut at an angle to reduce friction. The millstone needs to be dressed with furrows in a specific pattern to grind evenly. He drew the furrow pattern. 8 sets of radiating grooves called harps, with a slight curve to push flour outward as the stone turns. He had done this drawing once in school as a technical exercise, and his professor had given him full marks and told him it was the most detailed mill drawing he had seen from a student. That professor's name was Kim, and he always smelled like pipe tobacco, and he once told Junho that the purpose of architecture was to make people's lives less hard. Not easier, less hard. There was a difference. Junho collapsed at 4 a.m, with the drawing half finished and the frequency screaming in his chest and his nose bleeding into the dirt. He woke 30 hours later. Grandmother Han was pressing a cold cloth to his forehead. She said he had bled from the nose and from the ears, and that his heart had been beating so fast she could see it through his shirt. She said if he kept doing this, he would die. Junho asked if the mill was finished. She said he should worry about his own body first. He got up and walked upstream on shaking legs. The mill was there, partially. The wheel was built, the housing was up, the axle was in place, but the gearing and the millstones were unfinished. The drawing had been incomplete when he collapsed, and the gift had built only what was drawn. He needed to finish it. But his body was telling him very clearly that it had nothing left. He sat on the bank next to the half-built mill and put his head in his hands. A voice behind him said that was a water wheel. Junho turned around. It took Gunchil 4 days. Junho sat nearby and advised. He described the gear ratios, the tooth profiles, the bearing surfaces. Gunchil listened and translated Junho's instructions into wood. He worked slowly and carefully and made several pieces twice because the first attempt was not precise enough. But on the 4th day, he slotted the last gear into place and opened the sluice gate, and water poured into the wheel buckets. And the wheel turned and the gears engaged, and the runner stone began to spin against the bedstone with a deep grinding hum that echoed across the settlement. Everyone stopped what they were doing and listened. It was the sound of bread, of winter survived, of a community that had just become something more than a collection of refugees. Taysik brought the first sack of harvested barley and poured it into the hopper. Flour began to fall into the collection trough, white and fine and warm from the friction of the stones. Taysik took a handful and held it to his face and breathed in, and his eyes were wet. Junho watched from the bank, where he sat wrapped in a blanket because his body was still too weak to stand for long. Gunchil came and sat next to him. The old carpenter said something quiet. He said he had been building things his whole life, 70 years, houses and barns and fences and carts. And he had never once built something that made a man cry with a handful of flour. He said he wanted to keep building with Junho. He said he did not understand the gift, or the way the ground moved, or the way buildings appeared overnight. But he understood the feeling of watching someone hold flour and weep. That feeling he understood. Junho looked at the old man and nodded. Then he lay back on the ground and closed his eyes and slept. The harvest continued for 12 more days. By the end, they had collected 28 bags of barley and milled half of it into flour. Not quite the 30 bags the assessors demanded, but close. Close enough to negotiate. Junho spent the days between sleep advising on the harvest rotation and slowly recovering his strength. His body was learning, or perhaps adapting. The first house had knocked him out for a day, the quarantine station for 14 hours, the mill for 30 hours. But each recovery was slightly faster than the last. His muscles still ached and his nose still bled sometimes when the frequency peaked, but the drain was becoming manageable, like a muscle being trained. Meanwhile, the settlement continued to grow. 21 days after the messenger's visit, the assessors arrived. 3 men on horseback, accompanied by Tax Lieutenant Muhan and 6 soldiers. The lead assessor was a thin man with a clerk's posture and ink-stained fingers who introduced himself as Assessor Pyong. He carried a ledger and a measuring rod, and he moved through the settlement with the brisk efficiency of a man who had valued 1,000 properties and expected this one to be no different. Junho walked with him. Pyong counted buildings, 16 now. He counted residents, 37. He counted livestock, 4 goats that had arrived with one of the refugee families, 1 cow that had wandered in from the grassland and been claimed by Taxation. He inspected the mill and wrote in his ledger for a long time. He tasted the flour. He measured the water channel. He walked the perimeter and noted the fence. When he was done, he sat down at the central basin and opened the ledger and calculated. Junho sat across from him and waited. Pyong said the assessment was 30 bags of grain and 5 bags of salt per quarter, as stated in the original notice. Junho said he had 28 bags of barley and no salt. Pyong said that was insufficient. Junho said he understood. Then he asked Pyong how many settlements in the outer marches currently produced their own milled flour. Pyong looked up from his ledger. His expression changed slightly. Junho said he knew the answer. Winter came on the 23rd day of the settlement's existence. Junho woke to white. Snow had fallen in the night. Not much, a thin layer that softened every edge and silenced every sound. He stood in the doorway of his house and watched his breath make clouds in the still air. The settlement looked different under snow. Cleaner, quieter. The 16 buildings stood in their planned positions along the ridge and down toward the stream, and the snow on their roofs made them look like they had been there for years, not weeks. The chimney smoke from each house rose straight up into the windless morning. The water channel still flowed, because Junho had designed the gradient steep enough to resist surface freezing. The mill wheel turned slowly in the cold water. Steam rose from the warm stone of the forge where Chanwoo was already working. Junho counted the chimneys. 16 fires. 16 families warm. That number mattered more than anything else right now. The first week of winter was a siege, not by soldiers, by cold. Temperatures dropped so hard that ice formed on the inside of the windows each morning. The stream slowed to half its normal flow. The wild barley fields were buried under snow, and the remaining unharvested grain was lost. Firewood consumption doubled overnight. Junho had planned for this, but planning and experiencing were different things. On the 3rd day of winter, Wool-hee came to him and said her house was cold. She said the wall facing north had frost on the inside. Junho went to look. The wall was sound, the construction was solid, but the single layer of stone was not enough insulation against sustained below-freezing temperatures. He should have built double walls with an air gap. He had known this. He had drawn double walls for the quarantine station, but when he built the first wave of houses, he had been exhausted and rushing, and he had cut corners. This was his mistake, not the land's, not the gifts. His. He told Wool-hee he would fix it. That night, he drew an addition for her house. An inner wall of packed earth 20 centimeters inside the existing stone wall, with the gap filled with dried grass for insulation. He thought about Wool-hee specifically, the woman who flinched when hands were raised near her face, the woman who needed a door that locked from the inside. Junho spent the next 3 days retrofitting every house in the settlement, not with his gift, with his hands and with help. The gift had limits, and his body had limits. And if he used the gift for every wall in every house, he would be unconscious for a month. So he taught. He gathered Gunchil and Doksam and Taesik and Chanwoo and Yeonwoo, and he showed them how to build an inner wall. How to mix earth and straw into a paste that dried hard and held heat. How to leave a gap between the inner and outer walls and pack it with dried grass. How to seal the gaps around windows with clay mixed with animal fat. It was not elegant. It was construction site improvisation, but it worked. The team spread out through the settlement, and over 3 days, every house got an inner wall. The temperature inside each building rose noticeably. Children stopped coughing. Old people stopped shivering. Grandmother Han declared that Junho was a saint. Junho said he was an idiot who should have built double walls in the first place. On the 8th day of winter, the first real test arrived. Not cold. People. A group of 23 refugees appeared from the northwest. They had been walking for 9 days from a town called Chongha that had been destroyed, not by demons, but by soldiers of the Principality of Cholha. The soldiers had crossed the border and burned the town as a message to the regional garrison, and then retreated before any response came. The refugees were in bad shape, frostbitten, starving. 3 children were being carried because they could no longer walk. An old man at the back of the group was clearly dying. He was on a makeshift stretcher carried by 2 young men whose arms were shaking with the effort. Junho met them at the settlement boundary. He looked at 23 new faces and felt 2 things at once: compassion and mathematics. 23 people added to the existing 37 was 60. 60 people consuming food and firewood and water in winter when all 3 were limited. His food reserves would last the current population about 6 weeks, with 23 more mouths that dropped to roughly 4 weeks, maybe less if the children needed extra feeding to recover from malnutrition. He could not afford to take them in. He also could not afford not to.
Junho told them to come inside. He sent Yeonwoo to stoke every fire. Junho looked at her. She was maybe 24. Her face was gaunt from hunger, and there were dark hollows under her eyes. But her posture was straight. Her voice did not break. She had walked 9 days through snow with 10 orphans and 13 other refugees, and she was sitting across from him, not begging, but negotiating. He asked her what skill she had. She said she could organize people. She said she had run her father's household since she was 16, because her mother died in a fever, and her father was too busy being headman. She managed supplies and schedules and disputes and harvest rotations, and she was good at making people do things they did not want to do. Junho felt something shift in his assessment of her. Not attraction, recognition. This was a person who ran things, who saw systems, not just people. He needed that. He desperately needed that, because managing 37 people was already stretching him past his limit, and with 60, he was going to break unless someone shared the load. He told Yuna that she and her people could stay. He told her that the children would have a building by morning. She looked at him like she was measuring the distance between a promise and a lie. He said he did not make promises he could not keep. She said everyone said that. He said she would see for herself. That night, Junho drew again. But this time, he was not drawing a single house. He was drawing a complex. A children's home. A main hall with a large hearth at the center and sleeping alcoves along both walls. Each alcove sized for 1 child, with a shelf for personal belongings and a curtain for privacy. A kitchen connected to the main hall with a pass-through window so the cook could watch the children while working. A bathing room with a heated floor. And behind the main hall, a separate, small room. Just one room, with a bed and a table and a chair, and a window facing east, and a door with a lock on the inside. This room was for Yuna. He thought about her as he drew it, a woman who had not had a space of her own since she was 16, who had spent 8 years managing everyone else's needs, who sat across from him with straight posture and steady eyes, because breaking down was a luxury she could not afford when 10 children were depending on her. She needed a room that was hers, where she could close the door and sit in silence and not be needed for 5 minutes. He drew the room with the window facing east, because east was where the sun came first in the morning, and morning light was a kindness to people who carried heavy things. The settlement now had 60 people and 18 buildings. Food was the crisis. Junho's flour supply was shrinking daily, and wild game was scarce in winter. He called a meeting at the central basin. Everyone who could stand came. He laid out the situation plainly. He said they had food for about 4 weeks at current consumption rates. He said they could extend that to 6 weeks by rationing, but rationing meant children and the elderly would go hungry first, because that was how shortages always worked, unless you planned against it. He said he had a plan. They would establish ice fishing on the stream. The stream did not freeze completely because of the current, and there were deeper pools upstream where fish gathered in winter.
They would build fish traps using Chan Wu's metalwork and set them in the pools overnight. They would also begin smoking meat and fish to create preserved food. A smokehouse needed specific conditions: low heat, dense smoke, proper ventilation. He would design one, and Gunchil would build it, because Junho's body could not sustain another gift construction for at least a week. He also said they needed to start planning for spring. Doksam would lay out field plots along the south-facing slope, where snow would melt first. They would need seed. He asked if anyone had brought seed grain. 3 families had, small amounts hidden in their clothes when they fled. Barely enough to plant a fraction of what they needed. But it was something. Yuna stood up and said she would manage the rationing. She said she had done it before in Changha during a lean year. She said nobody was going to starve. She said it in a voice that made it sound less like a promise and more like a threat directed at starvation itself. Junho looked at her. She looked back. Something passed between them that was not spoken and not named. Gunchil built the smokehouse in 3 days from Junho's drawings. Simple box structure, stone walls for fire resistance. A fire pit at one end with a low chimney that channeled smoke through the interior before venting at the far end. Racks inside at different heights for different products. Fish near the top, where the smoke was thinnest. Meat lower, where it was densest. Junho had explained the chemistry as best he could. Smoke contained compounds that inhibited bacterial growth. Low temperatures below 70 degrees dried the surface without cooking the interior. The combination of surface drying and chemical preservation could extend shelf life from days to months. Gunchil did not understand the chemistry, but he understood the carpentry, and he built the smokehouse exactly to specification. Chan Wu forged fish trap frames from scrap metal. Taesik and 2 of the Changha refugees set the traps in the deep pools upstream. On the first morning, they pulled in 14 fish. Not a feast, but not starvation. Yuna took control of the food stores with the calm authority of a general assuming command. She counted every grain. She measured every portion. She assigned cooking rotations so the labor was shared. She set up a feeding schedule that ensured children and elderly ate first and ate more. She did all of this without raising her voice. She simply appeared at each meal and handed people bowls with exactly the right amount and looked at them with those steady eyes, and no one argued. Junho watched her work and realized that he had been trying to do everything himself: design the buildings, plan the infrastructure, manage the people, ration the food, survey the land, negotiate with tax collectors. He had been doing it all alone because that was what he had always done. In his old life, he had worked alone in an office at 3 in the morning, because trusting a colleague meant giving them a chance to steal his work. That reflex had followed him across worlds, and it was killing him. Not metaphorically. Actually. His body was failing. The nosebleeds were becoming more frequent. His hands trembled even when he had not used the gift. His weight was dropping despite eating full rations. He was burning himself alive from the inside, trying to carry a city on his shoulders. On the 15th day of winter, Junho gave Yuna the town plan, the full plan, the one he had drawn on the ground weeks ago. He had recreated it on a flat piece of bark using charcoal. Every street, every block, every building lot, the market, the workshop district, the common house, the perimeter road, the wall. He handed it to her and said this was the plan for what this place was going to become. He said he could not build it alone. She looked at the plan for a long time. She traced the streets with her finger. She touched the market square and asked what would be sold there. He said everything. She touched the school and asked who would teach. He said they would figure that out. She touched the small room at the back of the children's home that he had drawn separately in the corner of the plan, and he saw her jaw tighten for just a moment. Then she looked up at him and asked what he needed her to do. He said he needed her to manage the people, so he could focus on the buildings. She said she was already doing that. He said he knew. He said he was asking her to do it officially, as his partner, not his subordinate. She was quiet for a moment. Then she asked if he was going to take credit for her work. He blinked. She said every man she had ever worked for had taken credit for her work. Her father took credit for the household she ran. The village council took credit for the harvest rotation she designed. She asked if Junho was going to be different. He said he understood why she was asking. He said that where he came from, someone stole every piece of work he ever made and put their own name on it. He said he knew what it felt like to build something and watch someone else take the bow. He said he would not do that to her. She studied his face. She must have found whatever she was looking for, because she nodded once. Then she folded the town plan carefully and put it inside her coat. She said she would need a copy for the common house so everyone could see it. He said he would make one. She said good, then she left to check on the evening meal. Junho sat alone by the basin as snow fell softly around him. The settlement was quiet in the way that winter evenings are quiet, when everyone is indoors and the fires are lit and the wind is down. The response from Namester Beck arrived on the 22nd day of winter, a single rider in a gray cloak carrying a sealed letter. Junho opened it, standing by the central basin with Yuna at his side. The letter said that the flour supply proposal was accepted on a provisional basis. The settlement would deliver 10 bags of milled flour per quarter to the regional depot at a rate 20% below market price. In exchange, the grain tribute was suspended for 4 quarters pending review. It was signed by Assessor Pyong and countersigned by the office of Namester Beck Guangzhou. Junho read it twice and handed it to Yuna. She read it once and said it was a trap. He asked what she meant. She said the rate was too generous. 20% below market was a discount, but not a punishing one. Beck was a man who squeezed border settlements until they cracked. This deal was soft. Too soft. Which meant Beck wanted something else. He wanted the settlement to grow. He wanted it to succeed. Because a successful settlement on the border produced more tax revenue in the long run than a burned-out ruin. But it also meant Beck now considered the settlement his asset, his investment, and investors eventually came to collect. Junho looked at her and said she was right. She said of course she was right. Then she went to organize the first flour shipment. The deal changed the mathematics of survival. 10 bags per quarter was manageable, even in winter, as long as the mill kept running and the wild barley harvest resumed in spring. But it also meant the settlement was now visible, not just as a rumor, as a line item in a regional ledger. A place with a name and a tax code and a delivery schedule. That visibility was both shield and target. Shield, because legitimate settlements had legal standing that squatters did not. Target, because every ambitious lord and hungry bandit in the outer marches could now look at a map and see exactly where the flour came from. Junho knew this. He had known it since the moment he proposed the deal to Pyong. Visibility was the price of legitimacy, and legitimacy was the price of survival. And survival was the only currency that mattered when you had 60 people depending on you. But visibility meant he needed walls. Real walls. Not the sharpened stake fence that currently ringed the settlement. Stone walls, high enough to discourage casual raiders and thick enough to stop arrows. He could not build them with his gift. Not yet. The children's home had nearly killed him, and walls were an order of magnitude larger. He needed to build them the old way. With hands and stone and time, Gunchill became foreman of the wall project. Junho drew the plans. A perimeter wall 2 meters high and 60 centimeters thick, following the contour line he had mapped weeks ago. The eastern section, along the ridge, would use the exposed rock as foundation. The southern section, above the floodplain, would sit on compacted gravel. The western section would be set back from the marsh with a drainage channel to prevent undermining. The northern section along the tree line would be backed by an earth rampart for additional mass. 4 gates. Main gate facing south toward the stream crossing. Secondary gate east toward the ridge road. Postern gate north toward the forest. Water gate west where the channel entered the perimeter. Each gate a simple arch with a wooden door reinforced with iron bands from Chanwu's forge. It was not a castle wall. It was a village wall, designed to slow attackers and channel them toward defended positions. Designed to say, "We're here, and we intend to stay." Kunchil organized the workforce. Every able adult contributed 4 hours per day to the wall. The rest of the time was their own, for their trades and their gardens and their lives. Junho insisted on this. He said a wall built by exhausted people was a wall built badly. 4 hours of focused work was worth more than 10 hours of grudging labor. The stone came from the ridge where Tessic and a crew of 6 quarried blocks using iron wedges and wooden sledges. The mortar came from the limestone deposits along the stream, mixed with sand and water and heated over a fire until it formed a paste. Chanwoo forged the tools. Doksam organized the material transport. Yuna managed the schedule so that wall building never interfered with food production or firewood collection or any of the other 50 tasks that kept 60 people alive in winter. The wall went up slowly, 10 meters per day on a good day, 5 on a bad one. Some days not at all, when snowstorms made the stone too slippery to handle. But it went up. And as it went up, the settlement changed. Not physically, psychologically. People who had been sleeping with one eye open since they arrived began to sleep through the night. Children who had been afraid to play beyond the fence began to run along the base of the rising wall, playing a game where they tried to touch every section before the next child caught up. Wulhee started leaving her door unlocked during the day. Small things. But Junho noticed them all, because noticing was his job. He noticed that Taexik stood straighter when he hauled stone, that Doksam hummed while he worked, that Yeonwoo had stopped flinching at loud noises. A wall was not just a wall. It was a promise made in stone. It said the people inside matter enough to protect. On the 35th day of winter, a woman arrived at the south gate. She was alone, which was unusual. Most refugees traveled in groups for safety. She was young, maybe 22, and she wore the remnants of military armor under a torn cloak. A broken spear was strapped to her back. Her face was hard, and her eyes moved, constantly scanning the settlement, the wall the people with, the automatic assessment of someone trained to evaluate threats. 2 of Taexik's quarry crew stopped her at the gate and called for Junho. He came and looked at her, and saw the insignia on her breastplate. A border garrison unit. Southern Command. She was a soldier, or had been. He asked her name. She said, Cho Hae-jin. He asked where she came from. She said the 9th Border Garrison at Hwangpo Pass. He asked what happened. Her jaw tightened. She said her company had been assigned to protect a village called Dalmi. She said the sentry captain had received a bribe from a demon war band to look the other way while they raided the village. She said 53 people died in the night while the garrison stayed behind its walls. She said she killed the sentry, who was supposed to be on watch, and walked out the gate and kept walking. She was a deserter. Desertion from a border garrison carried a death sentence. She had nowhere to go and nothing to lose, and she had followed the smoke from the settlement's chimneys because smoke meant people, and people meant a chance. Junho asked her what she needed. She stared at him. Nobody had asked her that. People had asked what she had done, what she wanted, what she could offer. Nobody had asked what she needed. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said she needed to be useful. She said she was good at one thing, and that was fighting, and that if she could not be useful, she might as well keep walking until the cold took her. Junho said he needed a guard captain. She laughed. It was a short, harsh sound with no warmth in it. She said he had 60 civilians behind a half-finished wall, and he was offering her a captaincy. He said yes. He said the wall would be finished. He said the people behind it needed someone who knew how to defend them. He said he was an architect, not a soldier, and that his strategic knowledge extended to fire exits and load-bearing walls. She looked at him for a long time. Then she asked where she would sleep. He said he would build her something. She said she did not need anything special, just a bed and a roof. He said he would build her something anyway. That night he drew. He did not draw a bedroom. He drew a command post, a training yard with a packed earth surface and a drainage slope so it would not become mud after rain, an armory with locked cabinets for weapons and a maintenance bench for repair, a barracks for the guards she would eventually train with individual bunks, not communal sleeping platforms, because soldiers who had privacy fought harder than soldiers who had none. And behind the barracks, a room for the captain, her room. It had a door that locked from the inside only. No exterior lock. Nobody could lock her in. Nobody could deny her exit. A window facing the main gate so she could see who came and went. A weapon rack on the wall nearest the bed so her hands could find steel before her eyes were fully open. He thought about Heijin as he drew. A woman who killed a corrupt sentry and walked into the cold because she could not stand to serve men who traded lives for coin. A woman who defined herself by usefulness because nobody had ever valued her for anything else. A woman who slept with a knife because the world had taught her that safety was something you held in your hand, not something you found in a place. He wanted to show her that a place could be safe, that a building could be a weapon if it was built right, that a command post designed for her specifically was more than a room. It was rank, authority, recognition. All the things that had been denied to her by officers who saw a woman with a spear and thought expendable. The frequency hummed, deep, almost angry.
The ground shook harder than it had before. By morning, the training yard was there. The armory was there. The barracks was there. And the captain's room was there, with a door that had no outside lock and a window facing the gate. Junho was unconscious for 26 hours after. When he woke, Grandmother Han was applying a paste of herbs to his nose to stop the bleeding. She said the young soldier woman had stood guard outside his door the entire time he was asleep. She said she did not know why, but she thought it might have something to do with the lock. Junho did not understand until he was strong enough to walk outside and found Heijin standing in the training yard with her broken spear, looking at the armory. She heard him approach and turned. Her face was different. Not softer, still hard, still watchful. But something behind the eyes had shifted. She said nobody had ever built her anything before. Not a bed, not a barracks, not a room with her own lock. She said the armory had space for 30 weapons, and she currently had 1 broken spear. She said that was a lot of empty racks. Junho said they would fill them. She looked at him and said she believed him. She said she did not know why. She said she usually believed no one. But a man who built a lock that only she could turn was a man who understood something about trust that most people never learned. She said she would guard his walls. He said he was grateful. She said he should stop building things until his nose stopped bleeding. He said he would think about it. She told him that was not a promise, and he should do better. He said fine, he would try. She said that was also not a promise. He went back inside to sleep. Heijin began training the next day. She gathered every person in the settlement who was willing to learn to fight. 14 volunteers. Farmers and refugees and teenagers who had never held a weapon. She looked at them standing in the training yard with their borrowed tools and their uncertain faces, and she said nothing for a long time. Then she said she was going to teach them 3 things: how to stand, how to hold, how to not die. She said she was not going to teach them to be heroes. Heroes died first. She was going to teach them to be walls. Human walls that held until the real wall behind them did its job. She drilled them for 4 hours every morning. Stance, grip, block, step. No offense, pure defense. She said attacking was for armies. They were not an army. They were a garrison. Their job was to hold ground, not take it. She worked them hard, but not cruelly. She corrected without yelling. She demonstrated without showing off. When Yanwu dropped his practice spear for the 3rd time, she picked it up and handed it back and said nothing. When Taexik complained that his back hurt, she showed him how to adjust his stance to protect his spine. At the end of the first week, the 14 volunteers could form a shield line that held for 60 seconds against Heijin's solo assault. It was not much, but it was something. And something was always better than nothing when the alternative was undefended. Spring arrived slowly. The snow did not vanish overnight. It melted in patches, revealing mud and wet stone and the green tips of grass pushing through the cold earth. The stream swelled with snowmelt, and Junho spent 2 days reinforcing the water channel banks to handle the increased flow. The fields that Daxam had marked out along the south-facing slope were the first to clear. Dark soil steaming gently in the morning sun. Daxam stood at the edge of the plowed strips and held a handful of seed grain and looked at Junho and said this was either going to work or it was not. Junho said that was true of everything. Daxam planted the first seed on the 63rd day. The settlement had changed over winter in ways that went beyond buildings and walls. It had developed habits.
morning routines, unwritten rules that everyone followed without being told. Gunchil opened his workshop at dawn. Chanwu lit his forge by sunrise. Grandmother Han swept the central square every morning with a broom she had made herself from birch twigs. Yanwu ran water from the basin to every house before breakfast. Wul-He left flatbread on doorsteps. Hejin's trainees assembled in the yard at first light. Yuna rang a bell she had asked Chanwu to forge to mark mealtimes, and the bell had become the heartbeat of the settlement. 3 rings for breakfast, 2 for lunch, 1 long ring for dinner. The sound carried over the wall and across the fields, and people said they could hear it from the stream half a kilometer away. Junho noticed all of this. He wrote none of it down. He carried it in his head the way he carried the town plan, as a living map of who did what and when and why. On the 68th day, a merchant caravan appeared on the southern road. 5 wagons loaded with cloth and iron and salt and dried meat. The lead merchant was a stout man named Pilsu, who traded the frontier routes between the interior and the borderlands. He had heard about the settlement from the flour supply riders who delivered to the regional depot. He had heard there was a new town on the edge of the outer marches that had a functioning mill and a forge and walls, and that it was run by a young lord who built houses that grew overnight. He had come to see for himself, and more importantly, to see if there was money to be made. Junho met him at the south gate and invited him in. Pilsu walked through the settlement with his mouth slightly open. He counted the buildings. 20 now. He counted the residents. 62. He looked at the wall, and the mill, and the forge, and the training yard. He looked at the water channel, and the smokehouse, and the children's home. Then he sat down at the central basin and said he had been trading the frontier for 15 years, and he had never seen anything like this. He said most frontier settlements were collections of shacks, held together with desperation and prayer. This was a town. A small, ugly, rough town, but a town with infrastructure and planning and intentionality. He asked Junho what he wanted. Junho said salt, iron, seed grain, cloth, tools, medicine. Pilsu asked what Junho had to trade. Junho said flour, smoked fish, and something else. He said that any merchant who established a regular trade route to the settlement would have guaranteed warehouse space inside the walls, a locked building, secure storage. No tariff on goods in transit, only on goods sold locally. The settlement would become a depot, a safe waypoint on the frontier where merchants could store goods between trips without fear of bandits or weather or Chola raiders. Pilsu's eyes changed when he heard this. He was a frontier trader. His biggest cost was not the goods themselves, but the losses from raids and spoilage, and the need to move everything in a single convoy because there was nowhere safe to leave things. A secure depot changed his entire calculation. He asked Junho if he was serious. Junho said he was an architect, and architects were always serious about storage. Pilsu laughed for the first time. They shook hands. The first trade agreement was signed on a piece of bark with charcoal and witnessed by Yuna and Grandmother Han. Pilsu left 3 days later with 10 bags of flour and a cartload of smoked fish. He left behind 20 bags of seed grain and 15 bars of iron and a bolt of heavy wool cloth and a ceramic jar of honey that Grandmother Han immediately confiscated for the children. He also left behind something less tangible: news. He was a merchant. Merchants talked. Within a month, every frontier trader between the Grey River and the Chola border would know about the settlement. Some would come to trade. Some would come to settle. And some would tell stories to the wrong people. Yuna said they should prepare for all 3. Junho agreed. The seed grain changed everything. Doksum had been working with scraps, a handful of barley here, a few scoops of millet there, barely enough to plant a vegetable garden. Now he had 20 bags. He organized the planting with a precision that surprised Junho. Fields divided into strips for different crops. Barley in the main fields, millet on the drier slopes, turnips and cabbage in the garden plots near the houses. He staggered the planting dates so that harvests would come in waves rather than all at once. He built simple scarecrows from sticks and old cloth. He dug irrigation ditches from the main channel to the field plots. He did all of this without being asked, because Doxum was not a man who needed to be told how to farm. He was a man who needed to be given a field. Junho watched him work and felt the same loosening in his chest he had felt with Gunchil. These people were not passengers, they were builders, each of them, in their own way. His job was not to do everything. His job was to build the place where everyone could do their thing. The first month of spring brought 29 new arrivals. Word from Pilsu's network was spreading. A family of weavers from the interior who had been expelled from their guild for supporting a workers' petition. A retired military engineer named Guan who had been discharged for questioning a fortification design and being right about it. Two sisters who ran a pottery workshop and had lost their kiln to a landlord's seizure. A herbalist, a tanner, a beekeeper. Each one arrived at the south gate and was met by Yuna, who recorded their name and skills and family in a ledger she kept in her coat. Each one was interviewed by Junho. Short conversations. What do you need? What can you do? What hurts? What matters? Each conversation fed the gift. Each name was a seed. The settlement grew to 91 people by the end of the first month of spring. 15 new buildings appeared during that month. Not all of them overnight. Junho was learning to manage his energy. Smaller buildings cost less. A simple workshop for the Potter sisters required only a few hours of sleep afterward. A weaving hall for the guild refugees took a full day. He rationed his strength the way Yuna rationed food. Carefully, with intent, never spending more than he could recover. On the 92nd day, a group arrived that changed the texture of the settlement entirely. 11 children, no adults. The oldest was 13.
A girl named Soyeon, who had walked her group 40 kilometers from a mining camp near the Cholha border where children worked the tunnels, until they collapsed, or were sold, or simply disappeared. Soyeon had organized the escape in the middle of the night, using a tunnel she and 2 other children had spent 3 months digging with spoons. She stood at the south gate, holding the hand of the youngest, a boy of 5, who had not spoken since the escape. Yuna brought them in. She put them in the children's home with the Chongha orphans. Junho came to see them that evening. He sat on the floor of the main hall and looked at 11 small faces looking back at him. They were thin and dirty, and several had injuries that had not been treated properly. The 13-year-old Soyeon sat with her arms crossed and her chin raised, and her eyes daring him to pity her. He did not pity her. He asked her name, and she told him. He asked what she was good at. She said escaping. He said that was a useful skill. He asked what the children needed. She said they needed food and sleep and a bath and for no one to hit them. He said he could guarantee the first 3, and that anyone in this settlement who hit a child would answer to Captain Heijin. And Captain Heijin's definition of answering involved a training yard and a very long afternoon. Soyeon almost smiled. Almost. She asked if the beds were really theirs. He said yes. She asked if anyone would come and take them in the night. He said no. The walls were real, and the locks were real, and Captain Heijin slept 30 meters away with a spear within arm's reach. Soyeon looked at the 5-year-old boy sitting silent beside her. She said his name was Jian, and he had not spoken in 2 weeks, and she did not know how to fix that. Junho looked at the boy. Small, hollow-eyed, hands curled into fists at his sides. He asked Soyeon if the boy had a favorite thing. Anything. A toy, a game, a color. Soyeon said he used to like birds. Before the mine. He used to sit outside and watch birds for hours. Junho nodded. He went outside and sat on the ground by the children's home and thought for a long time. Then he drew. Not a building. An addition. A small window in Jian's sleeping alcove positioned at the exact height where a child lying in bed would see straight out to the old oak tree. The oak where the sparrows nested every morning. The frequency hummed. Soft. Almost gentle. By morning the window was there. A small square opening with no glass, because glass did not exist here, but with a wooden shutter that could be propped open, positioned exactly at the height of a child's eyes when lying down, facing the oak. Jian woke up and lay in his bed and looked through the window and saw a sparrow land on a branch of the oak tree. The sparrow turned its head and looked directly at him. Jian opened his mouth and made a sound. Not a word, a sound. But it was the first sound he had made in 2 weeks, and Soyeon, who was watching from across the hall, put her hand over her mouth and turned away, so no one would see her face. The settlement reached 100 people on the 95th day. 100 people in a place that had been an empty field 3 months ago. Junho stood on the wall walkway at sunset and looked at what they had built. 26 buildings arranged along the grid he had planned. Streets that were still just packed earth paths, but that followed the layout. The central basin, the mill turning, the forge smoking, the training yard where Heijin's garrison now numbered 22 and could hold a shield line for 5 minutes. Children running between the buildings, playing a game that involved tagging the walls in a specific order. Smoke rising from chimneys. The smell of bread from the picarna, and meat from the smokehouse, and hot metal from the forge, and wet earth from the newly plowed fields. It smelled like a town. Yuna climbed up to the walkway and stood beside him. She held the ledger. She said 100. He said 100. She said they needed a name. He looked at her. She was right. The settlement had been called Sector 47, or the place at the stream, or that spot where the strange lord builds things. None of those were names. A name was important. A name meant permanence. It meant identity. It meant, we are not going anywhere. He thought for a while. He looked at the town spread out below him in the fading light. Then he said, Yongwol. Yuna asked what it meant. He said it meant a place that endures. She wrote it in the ledger. The town of Yongwol, population 100. Founded in the first year of the exile of Junho. She closed the ledger, and they stood together on the wall and watched the sun go down behind the western marsh, and the sky turned gold and red and purple, and the first stars appeared, and below them 100 people settled in for the night in homes that had been built for them by name. The name spread faster than Junho expected. Merchants carried it along the trade routes. Refugees whispered it on the roads. Soldiers stationed at border outposts heard it from passing travelers. Within 2 months of being named, Yongwol appeared on 3 different maps, drawn by 3 different cartographers, none of whom had ever visited. The maps were inaccurate. One placed the town 20 kilometers too far east. Another drew it with walls twice the actual size. The third labeled it Yongwon, which was close, but wrong. But the fact that it appeared at all meant something. Yongwol was no longer a rumor. It was a place. And places attracted attention. The first attention came from below, from the ground itself. On the 112th day, Gunchill was supervising the excavation of a new root cellar near the central square when his crew hit stone. Not the natural limestone of the ridge. Something different. Flat. Cut. Worked stone with edges too straight to be natural. Gunchill sent for Junho. He came and knelt at the edge of the pit and brushed dirt from the surface of the stone. It was a floor. A stone floor laid in a herringbone pattern with precise mortar joints that had survived however many centuries it had been buried. Junho's hands went still. He knew this pattern. Not from this world, from his architectural history textbooks. Herringbone flooring was a sign of institutional construction. Public buildings, temples, government halls. Structures built to last, and built by people who knew what they were doing. He asked Gunchill to widen the pit carefully. Over the next 3 days, the crew uncovered an area of about 12 square meters. The floor extended in all directions beyond the excavation. Whatever building this had been, it was large. At the eastern edge of the pit, they found something else. A wall stub. Cut stone blocks fitted without mortar so precisely that a blade of grass could not slide between them. The blocks were made of a stone Junho did not recognize, darker than limestone, denser, almost black, and warm. Not from the sun, warm from within. Junho pressed his palm against the stone and felt the frequency in his chest respond. Not a hum, a recognition, like 2 instruments tuned to the same key striking the same note. He pulled his hand back. His heart was beating fast. He told Gunchill to stop digging and cover the excavation with tarps and tell no one. That night, he sat alone in his house and thought. Ruins beneath the settlement. Old ruins. Very old. Built by someone with advanced masonry skills in a world where advanced masonry was supposedly unknown.
Built on the exact spot where he had been exiled. The exact spot. He had assumed his exile was random, a useless sun thrown onto useless land. But the ruins said otherwise. Someone had sent him here specifically. Someone who knew what was under the ground. Someone who expected him to find it. The question was whether that someone wanted him to succeed or to die trying. He did not sleep that night. In the morning, he went to find Yuna. He told her about the ruins. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she asked 2 questions. First, she asked if the ruins were dangerous. He said he did not know. Second, she asked who else knew. He said Gunchil and the excavation crew of 4. She said that was too many. He agreed. She said they needed to control the information. Not hide it permanently, but manage when and how it became known. He agreed with that, too. She said she would speak to the crew. He said he would speak to Gunchil. They looked at each other and something passed between them again. Not romance, partnership. The bone-deep understanding of 2 people who carried the same weight. Junho continued the excavation in secret over the next 2 weeks, working at night with only Gunchil and a lantern. They uncovered more of the floor and 3 more wall stubs. The building's footprint was emerging. Rectangular, about 30 meters by 20 meters. A large hall. At the center of the hall, they found a depression in the floor. A circular basin about 2 meters across and 1 meter deep, lined with the same dark, warm stone. Junho lowered himself into the basin and put both hands on the floor. The frequency exploded. Not painful, overwhelming, like standing inside a bell while it rang. Images flooded his mind. Not memories, blueprints. He saw a city. A vast city with wide streets and buildings that flowed into each other like a single organism. He saw aqueducts and bridges and towers and gardens on rooftops and streets that curved to follow the sun's path. He saw a central hall with a floor laid in herringbone pattern and a basin at its center where a figure knelt with hands pressed to the stone, exactly as he was kneeling now. The figure looked up and Junho saw its face. It was not his face. But the expression was the same, the expression of a builder who has found the foundation stone. The vision ended, and Junho gasped and fell sideways in the basin. Gunchil hauled him out. His nose was bleeding again, his ears too. His hands were shaking so badly he could not close them. But his mind was clear, clearer than it had ever been. He knew what this place was. This was the city of the founders. The first city of Hengrim, built 1,000 years ago by the line of architects who had raised civilization out of ruin after the War of the Falling Sky. The line that the combat houses had supposedly destroyed. The line that had been erased from every record and every doctrine. The line whose gift was not domestic and insignificant, but fundamental. The gift that built worlds. And it had been sleeping here, waiting for someone who understood. He told Gunchil everything. The old carpenter listened without expression. When Junho finished, Gunchil was quiet for a long time. Then he said that explained the warmth. Junho asked what he meant. Gunchil said that on the first night when he slept in the house Junho had built for him, the walls were warm. Not from the fire, from within, like the house itself was alive. He said he had thought he imagined it. Now he knew he had not. The buildings Junho created were not just structures. They were connected to something older, something in the earth. The Founders' Covenant. Build for people, not for power, not for glory, for the specific breathing person who will live inside these walls. That was the contract. That was why the gift responded to names and needs and personal knowledge, because the earth itself had been taught 1,000 years ago to recognize that intention, to reward it, to build alongside anyone who shared it. Junho sat in the dark next to the old ruins and felt the weight of 1,000 years settle onto his shoulders. He was not just building a town. He was continuing a work that had been interrupted by violence and greed and the doctrine that said swords mattered more than walls. He was the first founder in a millennium, and somewhere in the capital, someone knew it. The second attention came from above. A letter arrived by writer on the 125th day. It bore the seal of House So, not the regional branch, the main house, his father's house. Junho opened it with steady hands. The letter was written in formal court language and signed by So Hyung-gu, Lord of the Fifth March, Warden of the Eastern Gate, Patriarch of House So.
It said that reports had reached the house regarding unusual developments in Sector 47. It said that the house retained all hereditary rights over its exiled members. It said that a delegation would be sent to assess the situation and determine whether the exile terms required revision. It did not say, "I want you back." It did not say, "I was wrong." It said revision, a word that meant we still own you. Junho folded the letter and put it in his coat. He found Hejin at the training yard and showed it to her. She read it, and her face went hard. She asked how many soldiers a delegation from a great house typically included. He said he did not know. She said she would find out. She said they had time to prepare, because a house delegation from the capital took at least 3 weeks to reach the outer marches. She said she wanted the garrison at full readiness by then. He said he trusted her judgment. She looked at him. She said that was the second time he had said that. He asked what the first time was. She said the day he gave her the lock. He nodded. She went to the training yard and doubled the morning drills. Yuna's response to the letter was different. She did not focus on the military threat. She focused on the political one. She sat with Junho in his house that evening and laid out the situation as she saw it. House So had 4 options. First, they could demand Junho's return and try to absorb the settlement into their holdings. Second, they could demand tribute and try to make Youngwol a vassal territory. Third, they could discredit Junho and use the Exile decree to strip him of the land. Fourth, they could ignore the settlement and pretend it did not exist. She said options 1 through 3 all required the delegation to find weakness. A disorganized settlement, an unstable leader, unhappy people, evidence of mismanagement. If the delegation found strength instead, it changed the calculus. A strong settlement was harder to absorb. A prosperous territory was harder to demand tribute from without offering protection in return. A legitimate community was harder to discredit. She said Junho needed to show the delegation not a camp of refugees, but a functioning town with laws and trade and infrastructure and a population that was loyal by choice, not by force. Junho said that was what they had been building all along. Yuna said yes, but now they needed to make sure it was visible. She said she would organize a tour. He looked at her and smiled slightly. She asked what was amusing. He said nothing. He said she would have made a terrifying headman. She said she had considered it. They had 3 weeks. Junho used them. The streets were graded and packed with gravel. The central square was paved with flat stones from the river. The market area that had been an informal collection of blankets and baskets became a proper market hall with a roof and stalls and a weighing station. The school that had been Junho's intention since the first week, but that had kept getting delayed by more urgent needs, was finally built. Not by the gift, by hand, by the people of Youngwol. Gunchil designed the frame, Chanwoo forged the hardware, Tessik quarried the stone, the weavers donated curtains, the Potter sisters made clay tablets for writing. Yeonwoo, who was now 15 and had learned to read from grandmother Han, volunteered to be the first teaching assistant. The school opened on the 140th day with 28 students aged 5 to 14 sitting on benches in a room with windows facing east, because Junho had told Gunchil that classrooms should face east. Gunchil had asked why. Junho had said because children think best in morning light. Gunchil had looked at him for a long moment and then faced the windows east without another word. Junho also built something he had been planning since the first week, a bathhouse, public, open to everyone, heated by a furnace that Chanwoo built to Junho's specifications. The heating system used the hypocaust design. A raised floor supported on short stone pillars, with hot air from the furnace circulating underneath before venting through channels in the walls.
He had studied Roman baths in school and had always thought the hypocaust was one of the most elegant pieces of engineering in human history. Simple physics. Hot air rises. Channel it under a floor, and the floor becomes a radiator. The entire building becomes warm from the ground up. He drew it thinking about specific people. Grandmother Han, whose joints ached in the cold. Doksam, whose broken arm had healed but still stiffened in damp weather. Wolhee, who still flinched near people, but who he had noticed lingered near the forge because the warmth eased something in her. The frequency hummed. The ground moved. The delegation from House So arrived on the 155th day. 20 riders in polished armor carrying the banner of the 5th March. At their center rode a man Junho had never met but recognized from descriptions. Somyeongchul, his eldest brother, legitimate son, heir to House So. A swordsman whose awakening gift was called the Lightning Blade, and who had earned his rank in the border campaigns at age 19. He was 29 now. Tall, broad-shouldered, cold-eyed. He dismounted at the south gate and looked at the walls and the buildings and the people gathered along the main street, and his expression did not change. He looked at Junho standing at the gate, and his expression still did not change. He said that their father sent his regards. He said it without warmth or hostility, just information delivered. Junho said the delegation was welcome in Yongwol. Myongchul asked what Yongwol was. Junho said it was the name of the town. Myongchul looked at the settlement again. This time, something moved in his eyes. Not respect. Assessment. The assessment of a military man evaluating a position. He said they would stay 3 days. Junho said of course. Yuna had prepared the tour with the precision of a military campaign. Every building was clean. Every street was swept. The market was stocked. The mill was running. The forge was firing. The training yard was occupied by Heijin's garrison, executing formation drills with sharp discipline. The school was in session. The bathhouse was steaming. 112 people went about their business with the calm, ordinary rhythm of a community that functioned not because someone was watching, but because the systems worked. This was Yuna's genius. She had not staged a performance. She had simply made sure that the delegation would see the normal day. Because the normal day was the argument. Myongchul walked the tour with Junho at his side. He said little. He asked technical questions. How deep were the foundations? How thick were the walls? What was the capacity of the mill? What was the range of the water system? How many trained fighters in the garrison? He asked nothing about the people. Nothing about the names on the doorframes. Nothing about the warm floors or the eastern-facing windows or the locks that only open from the inside. He was counting assets. Junho answered every question accurately because accuracy was his strength and because lying to a military mind was pointless. Myongchul would see through it. Better to show everything and let the numbers speak. On the second day, Myongchul asked to see the forge. Chanwoo was working when they arrived. The young blacksmith was shaping a hinge pin with precise strikes of a light hammer. His left hand turned the piece on the anvil with the timing of someone who had done this 10,000 times. Myongchul watched for a while. Then he asked Chanwoo where he had trained. Chanwoo said he had apprenticed under Master Doke in the iron quarter of the capital until the plague took his master. Myongchul's eyebrows rose slightly. Master Doke was a famous smith. His work armed half the noble houses of Hangrim. The fact that his apprentice was working in a frontier town, making hinge pins instead of swords, was not lost on Myongchul. He asked Chanwoo why he stayed. Chanwoo looked at him and then looked at the forge around him. The anvil on the left side, where his dominant hand could work freely. The bellows pedal on the right, where his foot could operate without shifting stance. The tool rack at eye level. The coal bin positioned out of the smoke path. He said this forge was built for him. Not for a blacksmith. For him. He said he had worked in 3 forges before this one, and none of them fit. This one fit the way a glove fits a hand. He said the man who built it had asked him whether he was left-handed before he asked what he could forge. Myongchul looked at Junho. Junho met his gaze evenly. Neither spoke. They moved on.
On the evening of the second day, Myung-chul came to Junho's house unannounced. Haejin intercepted him at the door. She stood in his path and did not move. He was a head taller and probably twice her weight in armor, and he had a gift that could cut stone. She did not flinch. She said the captain's permission was required to enter. Myung-chul looked at her, and for the first time in 2 days, he showed something close to amusement. He asked if she would stop him. She said she would try. He said he respected that. She said she did not care what he respected, she cared what he intended. He said he intended to speak with his brother privately. She looked at Junho, who had appeared in the doorway behind her. He nodded. She stepped aside but stayed within arm's reach. Myung-chul entered. The house was simple. 1 room, a bed, a desk covered in drawings, a shelf with tools. Nothing that suggested lordship or luxury. Myung-chul sat in the only chair without being invited. Junho sat on the bed. They looked at each other. Myung-chul said he would be direct. He said their father had sent him to evaluate 3 things. Whether Junho was a threat to the house, whether the settlement was an asset worth reclaiming, and whether the gift called auto-build was more than what the registry said it was. He said he had evaluated all 3. He said Junho was not a threat because a man who builds bathhouses and schools was not a man who raised armies. He said the settlement was an asset, but a complicated one, because absorbing it would require garrisoning it, and the house did not have spare troops for frontier duty. He said the gift was more than the registry said, but he did not know how much more. Junho listened. Then he asked what Myung-chul would report. His brother was quiet for a moment. Then he said he would report the truth. That the settlement was small but functional. That its leader was competent but not dangerous. That the gift was unusual but limited to construction. He said he would recommend that the house leave Junho alone for now and revisit in a year. Junho asked why. Myung-chul said because the house had bigger problems. The king was dying. The 4 great houses were positioning for regency. Demons were pushing deeper past the Grey River. The northern plague was spreading. A small construction project on the frontier was not worth the political cost of a public family dispute. Junho said he understood. Myung-chul stood. He walked to the desk and looked at the drawings scattered across it. Street plans, building elevations, infrastructure diagrams. He picked up one drawing and studied it. It was the town plan, the full plan. The one Junho had given to Yuna and then recreated for the common house. Myung-chul looked at it for a long time. Then he put it down and said something Junho did not expect. He said the plan was good. He said he had studied siege fortifications and military engineering at the academy, and he could recognize competent planning when he saw it. He said the street layout was defensible. The building spacing was correct for fire breaks. The wall alignment used the terrain effectively. He said that if this plan was executed at full scale, the resulting city would be very difficult to take by force. Then he looked at Junho and said that was what he would not put in his report. Because a brother who built good houses was harmless. A brother who planned defensible cities was something else entirely. He left. Haejin closed the door behind him and looked at Junho. She said the brother was smart. Junho said yes. She said smart enemies were worse than strong ones. Junho said Myung-chul was not an enemy. Not yet. She said yet was a very small word for a very big problem. The delegation left on the 3rd morning. 20 riders filing out the south gate. Myung-chul paused at the gate and looked back. Junho stood on the wall above. Myung-chul raised a hand. Not a wave, an acknowledgement. Then he rode away. Junho stood on the wall until the dust settled and the riders disappeared over the southern horizon. Then he went to find Yuna. She was in the market hall checking the inventory with Soyeon, who had become her unofficial assistant despite being 13 years old. Yuna looked at him and asked what happened. He said they had a year. She asked, a year until what? He said a year until his family decided what to do about them. She nodded. She said that was enough time. He asked for what? She said for making sure that when House So came back there would be nothing left to decide.
She said a town of 100 was a camp. A town of 1,000 was a fact. Facts were harder to ignore than camps. And so the race began. Not against an army, against time. Against the slow, grinding gears of a kingdom that did not know what to do with a town that should not exist.
Junho threw himself into building. Son Manhwa arrived on the 215th day in the back of a merchant's wagon, buried under a pile of silk bolts, with a bruise on her jaw and a leather case of accounting ledgers clutched to her chest. Pilsu brought her. He said he had found her on the road 3 days east, being chased by 2 men with collection warrants. He said she owed money to a trading house that had bought her father's debts after his shipping company collapsed. He said the debt was fraudulent and everyone in the merchant quarter knew it, but the courts had ruled and the warrants were legal. He said she was smart, possibly the smartest person he had met in 30 years of trading. And he said if Junho had any sense, he would hire her before someone with fewer scruples did. Manhwa climbed out of the wagon and stood in the south gate of Junho and looked around with sharp, assessing eyes. She was 19, small, quick-moving. Her clothes were expensive but torn and dusty from travel. She carried the leather case like it was made of gold. Her hands were ink-stained and her fingernails were bitten short, and she had the posture of someone who had spent years bent over desks, working by candlelight. Junho came to meet her. Pilsu made the introduction and left to unload his trade goods. Junho asked Manhwa what she needed. She said she needed to not be arrested. He said she would not be arrested in Junho because Junho did not recognize collection warrants issued by courts that sold judgments to the highest bidder. She looked at him sharply and asked if that was an actual legal position or if he was making it up. He said he was making it up, but that, as the sole legal authority in Sector 47, he could make it policy if she preferred. She almost smiled. She asked what he wanted in return. He said he wanted to know what was in the case. She opened it on his desk. Ledgers, 5 of them, filled cover to cover with numbers in a handwriting so small and precise it looked like printed text. Revenue projections, cost analyses, trade route calculations, currency conversion tables, import duty schedules for 12 different ports, shipping manifests cross-reference with weather patterns and pirate activity and seasonal demand fluctuations. Junho looked at the ledgers and then at the 19-year-old girl who had written them, and his first thought was not about money or trade. His first thought was that the handwriting was beautiful. Not decoratively beautiful, functionally beautiful. Every number was clear, every column was aligned, every calculation was documented with its assumptions listed in the margins. This was the work of a mind that thought in systems, that saw patterns in noise, that understood that a number was not just a number, but a story about cause and effect. He closed the ledger and looked at Manhwa and said he wanted her to run the town's finances. She stared at him. She said she was a fugitive debtor with a warrant on her head. He said he was an exiled lord with a gift the kingdom considered worthless. She said she was 19. He said he had given military command to a deserter and agricultural authority to a one-armed farmer, and the town school to a 15-year-old, and he was not in a position to be picky about qualifications. She said he was either very brave or very stupid. He said he preferred the term pragmatic. Manhwa spent her first week in Junho doing nothing but observing. She sat in the market hall during trading hours and watched. She sat in the mill and counted output. She walked the fields with Doxam and estimated yield. She visited every workshop and every store and every household, and she wrote numbers in a new ledger. At the end of the week, she came to Junho's house and put the ledger on his desk and said they were going to starve. Not now, not this season, but in winter. She showed him the numbers. Current food production covered current consumption with a margin of about 12%. That margin sounded comfortable, but it was not, because the population was growing at roughly 30 people per month, and food production was growing at roughly 5% per month. The lines crossed in late autumn. By deep winter, they would be short by at least 20%. She said there were 2 solutions: increase production, which required more farmland and more farmers, and more time than they had,
or increase trade, which required something to sell that the outside world wanted badly enough to exchange food for it. Junho asked what they had to sell. She said flour from the mill was their current export, but the volume was limited by the mill's capacity and the grain supply. She said the workshops produced quality goods, but in small quantities. She said what they actually had was something no one else in the outer marches possessed: location. Yangwol sat at the intersection of 3 trade routes: the river road from the interior, the ridge road from the eastern provinces, and the frontier road from the Cholha border. Any merchant traveling between these routes had to pass within a day's ride of Yangwol. She said that if they built proper warehousing and established Yangwol as a bonded trade depot with standardized weights and honest scales and secure storage, they could charge transit fees that would fund enough food imports to close the gap. Junho stared at her. He said she had just described in 2 minutes a commercial strategy that would have taken a team of consultants 6 months to produce in his previous life. She asked what a consultant was. He said it was a person who told you what you already knew and charged you for it. She said she would not charge him. She said she would take a salary and an office and her name on the trade charter. He said, done. Junho built her a building, the trade hall. Not a warehouse, a proper commercial exchange. An open central floor where merchants could negotiate, a raised platform at one end with the town's official weighing station, private offices along both walls for trade negotiations, a records room with locked cabinets and a copying desk, and behind the trade hall, connected by a covered walkway, her office, her personal office. The walls were lined with shelves. He built the shelves at exactly the height where her ledgers would be at eye level when she was seated at her desk. The desk faced a window that overlooked the market square, so she could watch commerce in real time. On the wall behind the desk, he left space, a large, empty wall. When she asked about it, he said it was for her maps. She looked at the wall and then at him. She said she did not have any maps. He said she would. She was quiet for a moment. Then she opened her case and took out a folded piece of paper and unfolded it and pinned it to the wall. It was a trade route map of the entire eastern frontier, drawn in her tiny, precise handwriting, with every town and every road and every river crossing and every toll point, marked and annotated with distances and travel times and seasonal conditions. It covered half the wall. Junho looked at it and said he wanted copies for the common house and for the market hall, and for his own desk. She said she would make them. She said no one had ever asked for copies of her maps before. He said that was because no one had understood what they were looking at. She turned away from him quickly and adjusted the map on the wall, and her hands were steady, but her voice when she next spoke was not. She said the map was 2 months out of date, and she needed to update the Cholha crossings. He said she should use whatever resources she needed. She nodded without turning around. Within a month, Manhwa had transformed the settlement's economy. The trade hall was operational. 3 merchant caravans per week were passing through Yangwol and paying transit fees for secure storage. Manhwa had negotiated a preferential rate with Pilsu's network that gave Yangwol merchants a 10% discount on bulk goods in exchange for guaranteed warehouse access. She had established a system of standardized weights and measures using stone counterweights calibrated against each other to ensure consistency. She had created a simple but effective currency system using stamped clay tokens backed by flour reserves. Each token was worth 1 bag of flour. Merchants accepted them because they could redeem them at the mill at any time. It was not a sophisticated monetary system, but it was honest and transparent, and in a frontier where most trade was conducted through barter and trust, a reliable medium of exchange was worth more than gold. Junho watched her work and felt the same recognition he had felt with Gunchil and Doksam and Heijin. Each of these people was extraordinary, not because they had rare gifts or special powers, because they had been denied the chance to be extraordinary, and now that they had a place to stand, they were unstoppable. Manhwa had been told her whole life that a girl who was good with numbers was an oddity, a liability, an embarrassment. Her father had sent her to study abroad because her abilities made the family uncomfortable. When she came back educated and capable, the family had already failed, and her skills were treated not as salvation, but as evidence that she had spent too much time on the wrong things. Now she had an office with her map on the wall, and merchants who negotiated with her directly, and a title and a salary and a desk at the right height. And she was 19 years old, and she was running the economy of a town with 200 people, and she was very good at it. The food crisis did not materialize. Manhwa's trade depot strategy brought in enough revenue to purchase grain imports through Pilsu's network. By the 250th day, the food reserves were at 6 weeks and growing. The market was thriving. The workshop district had expanded to include a tannery and a pottery and a weaving house. The population had reached 240. New arrivals came almost daily now. Most were refugees. Some were opportunists. A few were people who had heard something specific about Yongwall that made them travel hundreds of kilometers to reach it. A carpenter who had heard about Gunchil's workshop. A healer who had heard about the bathhouse. A retired teacher who had heard about the school. A woman who had heard that in Yongwall they put your name on your bed. That last one arrived carrying nothing but a blanket and her own name, and when Yuna showed her the dormitory where newcomers stayed until permanent housing was built, the woman touched the wooden frame of the bed and asked if her name would really be carved there. Yuna said it would.
The woman sat on the bed and folded her hands in her lap and sat very still for a long time. And then she said she had been a slave for 11 years, and that in 11 years no one had spoken her name. Yuna sat beside her and asked what her name was. The woman said, Boksoon. Yuna wrote it in the ledger. She said, Welcome to Yongwol Boksoon. The woman closed her eyes. Yuna stayed with her until she opened them. Junho heard about Boksoon from Yuna that evening. He went to the dormitory and introduced himself and asked Boksoon what she needed. She said she needed to not be found. He said the walls of Yongwol had kept out tax collectors and soldiers in winter, and they would keep out whoever was looking for her. She said she also needed work. She said she could clean, and she could cook, and she could sew, and she could do laundry, and she could do anything that required hands that did not stop moving. Because if her hands stopped, she remembered things she did not want to remember. He looked at her hands. They were scarred and calloused, and they were indeed moving. Twisting the hem of her blanket, folding and unfolding it, never still. He said he would think about what she needed. That night he did not draw a house. He drew a laundry, a public laundry, not a luxury, a necessity. 240 people generated an enormous amount of dirty clothing and linens, and currently everyone washed their own in the stream or in basins at home. A central laundry with heated water and drying racks and pressing stones would save every household hours of labor per week. He designed it for Boksoon. Large stone basins with hot water fed from a furnace similar to the bathhouse system. Covered drying racks that worked in rain and sun. A mangle made from smooth river stones for pressing heavy fabrics. A sorting area. A folding area. A small room in the back with a chair and a window where the laundress could sit during quiet moments and let her hands rest. He thought about Boksoon as he drew, a woman whose hands could not stop because stillness meant memory. He designed the workflow so that there was always something to do, always a next step. Wash, then wring, then hang, then press, then fold, then sort, then deliver. A continuous chain of motion that would keep her hands busy from dawn to dusk. And at the end of the chain, the small room with the chair and the window. A place where she could learn slowly, over time, that stillness was not the same as remembering. That sometimes your hands could be still, and you could look out a window, and the world would not collapse. The frequency hummed, the building rose. Junho slept for 16 hours, and in the morning, Boksoon stood in the doorway of her laundry, and her hands were still for the first time since she arrived. Only for a moment, then they started moving again, but the moment had happened. Nymester Beck's move came on the 272nd day. A single envoy named Magistrate Yoon rode in on a fine horse with a smile that never reached his eyes. He offered Yongwol a charter, legal recognition, tax standing, official maps. In exchange, Beck would install a resident magistrate with power to approve or deny all new construction inside the walls. Junho saw the leash. Yuna saw the leash. Manhwa calculated the financial drain. At council that evening, Yuna proposed the counter. Accept the charter, refuse the magistrate. Propose that Yangwul appoint its own official, reporting to Beck quarterly. She said Beck would refuse, and in refusing, would expose that he wanted ownership, not partnership. The strongest negotiating position was making the other side justify their demands. Junho delivered the counter the next morning. Yoon's smile thinned. He said he would relay the message and left within the hour. Yuna warned that Beck would escalate. The next visit would be soldiers, not smiles. Hejin said the garrison stood at 35. Not enough. She needed fortifications and time. Junho spent 7 days studying the wall circuit and designed bent gate entrances with kill corridors and fighting platforms at every corner. He drew fire suppression pipes connected to a gravity reservoir on the ridge. He built all of it by hand, with Gunchil and Hejin's crews. No gift, no collapse. 3 weeks of stone and mortar. Good design did not require magic. It required understanding. By the 300th day, the population crossed 300. 70 households. A market and a school and a garrison of 40, and a library that Grandmother Han guarded like a dragon. 300 people who said, "I am from Yangwul." The demons came on the 319th day. 80 creatures from the outer forest crossed the tree line at dawn. Tall, gaunt figures with ashen skin and too many joints. They carried crude weapons and moved in coordinated packs. Hejin had the garrison on the north wall within minutes. The fighting platforms proved their worth instantly. Archers on the elevated positions cut into the climbing mass. The bent postern gate held without pressure. Heijin moved along the wall, directing reserves and killing whatever crested the top with mechanical efficiency. Junho could not fight, but he could see. He spotted the undefended south gate and sent Gunchil with 20 civilians to barricade it. The attack lasted 2 hours. 30 demons dead at the base of the wall, 4 garrison wounded, none killed. Heijin told Junho the wall held. He said the platforms saved them. She said they were his design and her idea, and the distinction mattered. She touched his arm briefly, cold fingers with blood on them. She said he had done well for an architect. He said she had done well for a deserter. She almost smiled. The attack changed Yangwul. Recruitment doubled. Complaints about construction labor stopped. The town understood that walls were not decoration. 2 weeks later, Beck set and walked through the south gate, carrying a leather-bound book dense with handwriting. A priestess historian from the great library of the capital, she had spent 3 years studying scrolls about a class of gifts erased from the registry 1,000 years ago. Builder gifts. The gifts of the founders. The Order of the Pure Blade had ordered the scrolls destroyed. She stole 3 trunks and fled. She told Junho the buried history. After the War of the Falling Sky, the founders had raised the first cities of Hengrim through the covenant with the earth. Build for people, and the earth builds with you. The kingdom prospered. Then, the combat houses realized that in a world where cities built themselves, swords were irrelevant. The doctrine of sword and blood was not ancient tradition. It was a coup. They killed the founders, dismantled every city brick by brick, buried the ruins, rewrote history. Every major city in Hengrim stood on founder bones. The covenant was not dead. It was sleeping, waiting for someone who would kneel in dirt and draw a house for a sick child and mean it. Junho built Saren a round library with high windows and east-facing reading light and cedar archive shelves. She wept when she saw it. He told her to open the doors to everyone. She did. The first anniversary passed quietly. Minha's numbers showed 378 people in 62 structures with a 6-month grain reserve and 12 workshops. Yangwul was a town. Junho felt nothing but exhaustion. His hands trembled constantly now. The gift was consuming him. Yuna found him in the dark and told him the council had run a full meeting without him for the first time. She said he had built something that could function on its own.
She said that was the hardest thing any builder could do. She said rest. He said he did not know how. She said the first lesson was sleep. She blew out the candle and left. He slept without dreams or bleeding for the first time in months. Kim Da-hyun arrived next, 17 years old, a gift called Tender Heart that made her hear other people's pain as sound. Broken bones snapped, fevers buzzed, grief howled like wind through an empty house. She could pinpoint 12 people in pain across the entire town, their locations, their injuries, their severity. The gift was destroying her. She looked 40. She needed silence. Junho built her a house near the western marsh, with triple-layered walls packed with wool and moss. Thick door, deep windows, felted floors. He did not know if architecture could dampen a magical gift, but he knew the covenant responded to intention. By morning, the house stood. Da-hyun walked in, and her hands dropped from her ears for the first time in years. The pain was muffled. She could choose what to hear. She cried from the absence of suffering, and slept 14 hours, and woke, and became the most effective healer Yongwol had ever seen. Emily Carter arrived on a raft, a port engineer from the western kingdom of Westenmark, whose survey ship had been burned by Chola pirates. Tall, red-haired, furious. She carried a waterproof case of engineering drawings so precise and functional that Junho recognized a pier immediately. He showed her the river and the natural harbor, and told her he could build anything she could design, but he could not design a port. She drew a mooring post in the mud. He touched it, and the gift raised it from the earth. She stared at the real timber post that had been a drawing 30 seconds ago. She asked how large a structure the gift could handle. He said the limit was not the gift. The limit was the design. She said she needed a week. It took 9 days. A full port, 80-meter quay, breakwater, 2 cranes, slipway, 3 warehouses. Every engineering detail calculated to the fraction because the gift built exactly what was drawn. They built it in sections over 3 weeks. When the last warehouse roof settled, Emily signed the drawings with her real name. The name Westenmark had refused to put on any document. Junho said the port was hers. She said he built it. He said building was easy, designing was hard. On the first day of the 3rd year, a letter arrived bearing the combined seals of House So and the Order of the Pure Blade. Junho was declared a heretic. The settlement was declared illegal. A combined force of 800 would arrive in 30 days to enforce the judgment. The council did not argue about surrender. They prepared. Haejin fortified and drilled and assigned every civilian a role. Yuna sent messengers to neighboring settlements asking not for soldiers, but for witnesses. 14 observers camped on the hills. On the 28th day, Junho descended into the Founder ruins and pressed his hands to the Covenant stone. He saw the ancient vision, the original cities, the combat houses destroying them, the Founders dying while still building, the earth screaming when the last one fell. 1,000 years of silence. Then himself, a man with a stick drawing a house for a sick girl. He told the earth he would build one more time. The earth said yes. The army arrived on the 30th day. 800 soldiers and knights filled the southern plain. Lord Hyung-gu called for his son. The gate opened and the people of Yongwol walked out. All of them. Grandmother Han first, with Minso. Then Yuna and her orphans. Haejin and the garrison. Every counselor. Every citizen. 392 people, each holding a wooden tablet carved with their own name. They stood in silence before the army. Junho came last. No weapon, one scroll. The city plan with every name. He told his father quietly that an heir was not someone who received a name, but someone who gave them. Grandmaster Troll called it blasphemy and swung his glowing blade. The earth answered. Walls of warm, dark covenant stone rose between them. The sword struck and the stone absorbed it like a mountain absorbs rain. More walls rose behind Junho. A maze of corridors and dead ends. A city growing in real time from the earth itself. Not trapping, channeling. making the army irrelevant. Junho stood at the center, bleeding from nose and ears, holding 400 names in his mind. Lord Hyunggu watched his son bleed and build and understood something he had never understood. This was power, not destruction. Creation. The power the doctrine had been invented to suppress. He removed his helmet. His soldiers lowered their spears. He rode away. Chol stood alone before unbreakable stone. The wall grew gently around him, forming a corridor that led away. A path that said, "You may leave." He left. The order walked away without striking a single person. Junho collapsed. Dahyun listened to his heart and said he would live. Minso wiped the blood from his face and called him Dada. He said he was tired. He slept. When he woke, Yuna was on the bench outside, reading by lantern light. She said the observers had gone to spread the story. She asked what he would build next. He said he did not know. He needed to talk to people first, find out what they needed. She smiled. She said the list was on his desk. He laughed quietly in the dark. Somewhere beneath him, the earth laughed with him. The walls stood. The names endured. The story was only beginning.